Hi, I'm Glenn Rogers, and this is Biblical Insights. In our video today, we're going to be talking about the problem of evil. What does that mean exactly? Well, in the world of philosophy, the problem of evil refers to all of the pain and suffering that exists in the world. And the question is, why is there so much pain and suffering in the world? And if God exists, why does he let there be so much pain and suffering? Seems like maybe that if God existed, he would cut down on the amount of pain and suffering there is in the world. And so what we call in philosophy the problem of evil is one of the main reasons why a number of people are atheists. Something bad happened, something that they were very upset about. I knew a man who was a believer, a Christian, and his wife gave birth to a set of twins prematurely. They had to be put in an incubator. The amount of oxygen that was put in, this was way back in the early 1960s, and they put in a little too much oxygen, and it damaged one of the baby's visual development, and one of the twin girls became blind, and she grew up blind. And then a couple of years later, his wife left, ran off with his best friend, and things just didn't go well for this guy. And he kind of, he thought, if God lets this sort of thing happen to people who haven't done anything wrong, who don't deserve this sort of pain and suffering in their life, then he's not a very good God, and I'm not going to worship him anymore. That's the way some people react. Some people get angry at God because bad things happen in their lives. Other people are just very confused about why God would allow the kind of things that happen. If he's really a good God and he's very powerful, then why doesn't he stop all of this? Why doesn't he make the world a better place? And so the problem of evil is a very important topic, and it's one of the main reasons why there are atheists in the world. Now, everybody who's not an atheist, everybody who is an atheist isn't such because of the problem of evil and the amount of suffering they see in the world. People are atheists for different reasons, okay? But one reason why some people are atheists is because of this subject that we call the problem of evil. And the problem of evil, if you understand it philosophically and you see how it's actually stated, which I'm going to get to in a minute, is really the only actual argument that atheists have ever come up with against the existence of God. Normally, when you're talking about the existence of God, the atheist will simply say, well, you can't prove God's existence. And we can adequately explain the presence of the universe without referring to God, and there are no good arguments for the existence of God, therefore God doesn't exist. This is what many atheists will say. But some of them will say the reason why we don't believe in the existence of God is because of the problem of evil. And so what exactly is that argument that they make? Well, the argument goes like this. A good and powerful God eliminates evil and suffering, pain, as far as he possibly can. That's their first premise, that a good, all-powerful God would eliminate or at least minimize pain and suffering in the world. Pain and suffering exists, and there's lots of it. Point number 2. Point number 3, therefore, God doesn't exist. A good, all-powerful God doesn't exist. Now, see, it's a very simple argument, just 3 basic points. Now, there are some arguments that have some additional points, and they're a little more complex than that. But the basic argument against the existence of God rooted in the problem of evil is just that simple. If an all-powerful good God existed, he would eliminate evil. He hasn't, because evil exists. Therefore, a good all-powerful God doesn't exist. Okay, that's the argument. Now, here's the question. Is that a sound argument? Is that a valid argument? And the answer is a resounding no. That is not a sound argument in any way, shape, or form. Now, when you study philosophy and you study critical thinking and logic and things like that, one of the things that you learn is that when an argument is presented, what you have to do is look at the argument point by point by point and determine from each point in the argument whether or not the argument is sound and valid. And the problem with the problem of evil is that the very first premise in the argument is not sound. It's not a good argument, not a good premise. The premise is that a good, all-powerful God eliminates evil as far as possible. Well, there's no basis for making that. There's simply an assertion that is not grounded in any kind of fact or knowledge. The people making that argument are not God, and they are not in any kind of a position to know what God would or wouldn't do in the world in relationship to evil. So they're making a statement that is simply an assertion, and it is not grounded in any kind of evidence or valid argument of any kind. So it's just not a sound argument. When we look more closely at the problem of evil, one of the things we realize is that definitions and terminology become extremely important. We're saying that pain and suffering is evil. Well, I think for some people, in some cases, it would be pretty easy for them to say, what's happening to me or what's happening to someone I love is evil. This is bad. There's nothing good about any of this. Well, let me suggest to you that that may not always be the case. And in fact, I can say it even more strongly than that, that is simply not the case. Even pain and suffering can be good. Now, let me give you some illustrations, okay? If I touch something that's very, very hot, if I put my hand on something that's very, very hot, it hurts, and I pull my hand away very quickly before the heat has any time or has a chance to do any serious damage to my hand. So I touch it, it hurts, and I immediately jerk it away. I may get a little bit of burn, and it may hurt quite a bit, but there's no real serious permanent damage there. Why? Because I felt pain, and I pulled my hand away quickly. Okay, in a case like that, pain isn't a bad thing. Pain's a very, very good thing. Okay, it kept me from getting badly burned and maybe being seriously disabled for the rest of my life. Okay, pain is not always a bad thing. When our babies are little, we take them to the doctor to get vaccinated against all sorts of terrible and dangerous diseases. And when they go, the doctor, or maybe he has a nurse do it, uses a very sharp needle and pokes them, usually when they're little babies, in the thigh, and gives them this shot. Well, the baby, reflexes from that, and it hurts, and the baby cries, and they don't like going. And, we understand there's pain involved there. And yet at the same time, we also know, but this is a good thing because we're vaccinating our children against these terrible diseases that could threaten their health and even their life if they don't get vaccinated against these diseases. So again, in this case, pain is a good thing. If I get a toothache, that pain tells me there's something wrong in there. So I go to the dentist. The dentist looks at it and he says, yeah, there's something wrong. Let's fix it. Now, he fixes it before it gets worse so that he doesn't have to pull the tooth out. Okay? again, in that case, the pain was valuable, it was beneficial, it was not evil, it resulted in something that was good and helpful. So it is simply not the case that pain, all the time, is evil. That's just simply not true. Okay? That is simply not true. Another consideration is that suffering is often very beneficial. Now, I understand that it depends on what kind of suffering. I get that and why it's occurring. But again, we're talking about how we use language and how we define words. Is it possible to say that all suffering is evil? No, it is not possible to say that. Not even a little bit. Okay? Because there is a good deal of suffering which is very beneficial. Okay, so I've already used the example of vaccinations. When either a child or an adult gets vaccinated, that's a good thing. Okay, that's a good thing. So it may hurt. We may feel the next day, we may feel a little bit sick from getting the vaccination. Many people who just got their COVID vaccinations, that later that day or the next day, their arm was sore and they felt bad and but that went away in just a matter of hours, and then they were protected against a very dangerous disease. And so whatever suffering was associated with that, it wasn't evil in any way, shape, or form. Think about someone who has to endure very, very rigorous physical training. Right now, as I'm videoing this, we're in early July of 2021. The Olympics are coming up, and many of these Olympic athletes have been working hard for years. They get up very early in the morning, and they do whatever physical activity is required of their sport or their event, and they work hard. And they push themselves, and they have coaches that push them. And sometimes they push themselves to the point of pain. Sometimes they work so hard that and push themselves so hard that when they're done, they're physically exhausted. They're just on the ground. They're just laying there, and their muscles get sore and tired, and they ache, and they have to get up again the next day and do it again. I remember when we were in junior high school. This was again back in the early 1960s. In our gym class, we had to run an obstacle course, and we hated that obstacle course. It was hard, right? You had to run across this little beam. You had to balance yourself so you didn't fall off, and then you had monkey bars. You had to jump up and swing across these and do it hand over hand, several feet off the ground, and then you had a wall, a 7-foot wall that you had to jump, and you had to climb up the wall and jump over the other side, and then you had to run up a ramp and then jump off the ramp into a sand pit below, and there were bars, and you had to run zigzag in and out of the bars, and then you had to run this big huge lap and everything. And I mean, we hated that thing. And our coach would push us, he'd blow that whistle and he'd say, come on, he'd push us hard. Man, we were exhausted when we were done with that thing. But you know what? After doing that for a couple of years in junior high school, guess what? We were all stronger. We were faster. We learned those skills and we developed muscles. When we were in high school, we ended up in a weight room, and we had to lift weights, and we had to lift heavy weights. And part of it was you had to lift quite a bit more weight at the end of the year than you did at the beginning of the year. And so you had to lift heavy and you had to work hard. We had to run. We ran around a quarter-mile track. We had to run a mile, so 4 laps around that track. It was timed, and we had to improve our time, and we had to run a mile at the end of the semester. We had to run a mile under a certain time, and all that was hard. It was hard work. We didn't like it. Yeah, but it was good for us. It was good for us. Okay? There are times when suffering isn't evil. Okay? Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that no suffering is ever evil and no pain is ever evil. Of course, I'm not going to say that. All right? But what I'm going to argue is that even the kind of pain and suffering that might be defined as evil, something that it doesn't seem at first to have any useful purpose, and therefore it can be defined as evil. In some cases, some people think that is true. I used to know a guy who was training to be a pediatrician. He had finished medical school at Yale Medical School, and he was doing his internship at UCLA Medical School, working with children to become a licensed pediatrician. And the reason he was an atheist is because as a pediatrician, he saw so many children suffering from disease or suffering from other kinds of situations. He saw babies being born where the mother was a drug addict, and so that baby is born addicted to heroin or addicted to some other terrible drug, and the baby has to go through withdrawal, and it is so much suffering and it's so much pain. And he says, why would God allow something like this? I can't worship a God who would allow this sort of thing. I can't even believe that if he exists, he would allow this, so I don't think he does exist. And you can kind of understand why he would feel that way. But here's the thing. We have to think in terms of the ultimate value of pain and suffering, okay? And there is a philosopher that we often refer to when we're talking about the problem of evil, and his name was Leibniz. He did his philosophy in the late 16 and early 1700s. He was a German philosopher, and he was very concerned about this problem of evil. And he came up with an argument that he called the best of all possible worlds argument. Now, what does that mean? Well, in a nutshell, what it means is that when God, in eternity, was considering what kind of world he would make, okay, he considered all the possible worlds that he could make. He could make the world this way, he could make the world that way, he could make it this way over here or that way over there. He could have made it any way he wanted to. And Leibniz said, he made the world this way. That includes pain and suffering. He made the world this way because for his purpose, this is the best of all possible worlds. Now, there was a French playwright who very, very much wanted to be a philosopher, but he wasn't really smart enough to be a philosopher. He was a clever playwright, but not nearly smart enough to be a philosopher. His name was Voltaire, and this argument from Leibniz just absolutely drove him crazy. He hated it, didn't like it, and he wrote a play called Candide, which was designed to make fun of the position best of all possible worlds. The reason he made fun of it is because he couldn't answer the argument. You see, when you're presented with an argument and you don't like it, but you can't answer it, you can't show where the argument is wrong, then you tend to resort to ridicule. And that's what Voltaire did. He resorted to ridicule. He just made fun of the argument. But the fact is, it's a very good argument, and it's a sound argument. When you look at what God's purpose is, God's purpose for human beings is not that they be trouble-free, not that they be pampered little babies who never experience any difficulties in life, who never understand what pain is, who never understand what suffering is. Okay, that's not God's goal. That doesn't help anybody grow and mature and become strong. It doesn't help them figure out how to solve problems, okay, and how to make the world a better place. If God made the world where we didn't have any challenges or problems, no pain and suffering, then we would be a bunch of weak little babies who couldn't do anything. And that wasn't God's purpose. That wasn't what God wanted for his human children. The purpose for our being here involves facing challenges and learning to overcome and getting stronger and tougher and smarter. And the way we do those things is by facing challenges, by going through pain and suffering. Someone says, well, how does cancer do that? You get cancer and then you die. Okay, so how does that make anybody stronger? Well, we are, as a species, we're on the verge of being able to cure cancer. Excuse me. How did we do that? How did we get smart enough to where we're just a few years away from being able to cure cancer? Well, cancer had to exist. People had to die from cancer. And then other people said, that's a problem that we need to solve. And we're going to solve it. We've already eliminated lots of other serious and dangerous diseases because we saw, excuse me, I'm sorry, we saw that they were causing suffering in the world, and we wanted to get rid of them. And so we did. We studied them. We figured out what they were. We figured out how to defeat them. We, as a people, grew and developed and matured because of the suffering of some people. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. So the thing we have to remember about the problem of evil and why the world is the way it is that God's purpose included challenges, even pain and suffering, so that we would learn how to cope, how to get strong. We learn compassion when we see other people suffering. If we never saw anybody challenged or suffering of any kind, how would we learn compassion? How would we learn to be compassionate people? Well, we couldn't. We learn to be compassionate because we see, we encounter, and we face challenges. And when we see other people facing challenges and suffering, then we learn to be compassionate people because of that. And that's a very important trait that God wanted us to have. So you see, God has a purpose here, and his purpose doesn't include creating people who can never grow to be strong and capable and mature and able to overcome. So he made the world where we would have challenges. Another part of this whole larger equation is our perspective on suffering. Okay? What appears to be horrible suffering to us, I think to God, isn't all that much suffering, because he understands suffering. Okay? Let me give you an example. Let's say we have a little girl. Let's call her Sally. And let's say Sally is 4 years old. And Sally has a little doll, okay, that she takes with her everywhere. Let's say she's named the doll Margaret. Okay? So her doll Margaret is her best friend and is always with her. And one day her parents are traveling, they're going somewhere, and they stop and they go into a store or a restaurant to get something to eat. And Sally has Margaret with her, but in the course of eating and getting ready or anything, and they had to hurry, they were on a schedule, and Sally forgets Margaret and leaves her in the store or the restaurant, wherever they are. And it only discovers it later when they're already back on the road and far away, and she begins to cry, and she's lost Margaret, and this is the most tragic and horrible thing that she can imagine. She can't think of anything worse than losing Margaret. So her dad turns around, drives all the way back to try to find Margaret. They go in, and the doll is already gone. Margaret's already gone. Somebody else took her, whatever. Nobody turned her in to the office or whatever, and so Margaret's gone. So they get back in the car. Sally is crying. She's inconsolable, okay? And she thinks this is just absolutely horrible. Okay, what her parents know is that she's hurt and sad because she lost her doll, because she's a 4-year-old child. Okay? And 10 years from now, from then, when she was, say, 14, she wouldn't even be interested in Margaret. But if she were and she lost it, she'd probably have a different perspective on it. And if she didn't in 10 years, she certainly would in 20 or 30. In other words, the more she matures, the more she grows, the more she develops, the stronger she gets, the tougher she gets, the more she realizes that the loss of a childhood toy is not a tragedy. Now, you say, well, what are you doing? Comparing the evil and suffering in the world where people really suffer horrible diseases and they die and everything. Are you comparing that to a child losing a toy? Yes, I am. That's exactly what I'm doing. Because we are those 4-year-old children who see the suffering going on around us as the most horrible thing we can imagine. It's just tragic. And yet, from God's point of view, he's looking at eternity, not a few days or weeks or months or even years here on the earth where we're not as comfortable as we would like to be. He understands that what we think is suffering and what he knows is suffering are two very different things. Okay, what we think is a horrible tragedy, to God is not a horrible tragedy. Most people are afraid of death. They fear dying, and they think dying's a bad thing. You know, the Bible says that in heaven they rejoice whenever a child of God dies. Why? Because that child is coming home. The child is being transitioned from this physical realm, going into the spiritual realm, is going to be with God. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. You see, it all depends on one's perspective. So much of life depends on perspective. Evil, pain and suffering. Yeah, I've had my share of pain and suffering, and it wasn't pleasant. But was it evil? If you learn something from it, if you grow from it, if you get stronger, if you improve, was it evil? Turns out it was a good thing. It hurt, but it wasn't evil. And if somebody else learns something from my suffering, then again, even though it's unpleasant for me, something good came from it. A greater good justifies the existence of evil and suffering in the world. God's purpose for human beings justifies the existence of pain and suffering in the world. Well, those are my thoughts for the day. I hope you found them interesting and hopefully helpful as well. And I would leave you with these thoughts. Read your Bible, pray, go to church, and may God bless.